That patent belongs to us, not to you. No single individual can control this company.
You're right. No one controls the company. But someone controls the granting of permissions, and that person isn't you.
My name vanished before the meeting officially began. The slide on the screen read, Core Technology Update. The room was full, the agenda was packed, and yet the space where my name usually appeared was empty, as if it had never belonged there. No one reacted. That silence landed harder than any raised voice. The CEO's son didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly, glanced around the table, then looked straight at me. This role no longer requires your involvement, he said. We've outgrown the need for individual contributors. A few people nodded, not in agreement out of habit. The meeting rolled forward as if nothing unusual had happened. I stayed seated, suddenly aware that I had been removed without being dismissed. In corporate America. That's the first step. I was the inventor behind the core patent they were reviewing. I designed the architecture that made the technology scalable, defensible, and profitable. I structured the licensing framework that allowed the company to expand without losing control of its own system. I wasn't visible because I didn't need to be. Results spoke louder than titles until titles mattered more. Across from me. The CEO's son continued speaking with polished confidence. He talked about efficiency, modernization, and leadership alignment. His authority came from bloodlines and timing. Mine came from years of building something that couldn't be swapped out like a slide deck. No one asked me a question. No one acknowledged the shift. Laptops stayed open. Pens kept moving. This wasn't a confrontation, it was an erasure. They weren't firing me yet. They were deleting me from the process first, making my absence feel procedural instead of deliberate. The slide changed. My work was reduced to a bullet point labeled licensing framework. No explanation, no attribution, just a compressed summary, stripped of its conditions and risks, treated like a background detail instead of the foundation it was. That was when I understood the real insult. They didn't think I was dangerous, they thought I was optional. They didn't escort me out. They erased me first. Let's pause here for just a second. How are you holding up today when you get the chance? Try a slow evening walk or a few gentle leg stretches. Small. Steady habits really do protect your health. Tell me where you're listening from right now. And if this story resonates with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. Everything that worked inside that company carried my fingerprints, even when my name stopped appearing in places it used to belong. The patent didn't arrive as a breakthrough moment or a lucky spark. It came from months of late revisions, failed prototypes, and decisions no one wanted to make because they were expensive, slow, and unpopular. I built the architecture deliberately, knowing it had to scale, survive audits, and resist shortcuts from people who would eventually inherit authority without understanding risk. When the board asked about equity, I declined. I didn't want shares. Shares could be diluted, voted away, or turned into leverage against me. I wanted control over the thing that actually mattered, so I kept ownership of the intellectual property and licensed it cleanly, with terms precise enough to protect the system long after I was gone. At the time, they called it cautious. In hindsight, it was survival. As the company grew, everything depended on that foundation. Sales presentations leaned on it. Contracts assumed it. Revenue forecasts trusted it without ever reading how fragile misuse could be. My role stayed quiet by design. I solved problems before they reached executives, and when things worked, no one needed to know why. That invisibility felt like trust until it didn't. After the meeting, the erasure continued in smaller, sharper ways. Email threads I had started years ago stopped including me. Calendar invites disappeared without explanation. My access to internal documentation shifted from full to partial, then from partial to view only. No announcement followed. No justification was offered. Each change was subtle enough to deny intent, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. The CEO's son seemed energized by it. He liked authority in motion. Decisions that proved independence. Dependence made him uncomfortable, especially dependence on someone he hadn't chosen. I watched him replace understanding with confidence, believing that leadership meant removing variables rather than learning them. He wasn't cruel. He was worse certain. What unsettled me most wasn't the loss of access. It was the speed. Years of contribution unraveled through a series of clicks, approved by people who benefited from my work while convincing themselves It no longer required me. That kind of injustice doesn't shout, it tightens. I had written it to protect continuity, not myself. Assuming professionalism would outlast ambition, it required no reminders, no enforcement, and no confrontation to function. As long as I remained the technical lead, everything stayed authorized. The moment I didn't, the framework changed quietly, automatically, and completely. No alarms were designed to sound, because the clause was meant to prevent damage, not announce punishment. That distinction would matter more than anyone in that room could imagine then. A short appendix, a condition everyone signed and promptly forgot. When I finally opened the agreement again, I didn't feel anger. I felt relief. The document was exactly as I remembered it, dry, precise, and indifferent to emotion. Buried past the commercial terms and performance metrics was the clause no one ever discussed out loud. The key person provision wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten lawsuits or penalties. It simply defined permission. The language was careful. The license remained valid only while I held the role of principal technical authority for the patented system. If that condition changed, authorization changed with it. No breach was required. No dispute needed to be proven. The right to use the technology existed only alongside my designated position. That was it. Simple, enforceable, and very easy to forget when everything seemed to be working. I didn't notify anyone. I didn't ask for a meeting. There was no email reminding them of obligations they had already signed. Doing nothing was the cleanest option. The clause wasn't designed to be triggered by action. It was designed to respond to decisions already made. They had chosen a future without me. The agreement had already accounted for that. Days passed. Inside the company, the system kept running. Dashboards stayed green. Clients logged in without interruption from the outside. Nothing appeared wrong, which made the silence more effective than any confrontation could have been. Authorization failures don't announce themselves. They surface later, when signatures are required, audits begin, or questions can't be deferred. I watched carefully, not out of spite, but out of discipline. Control isn't loud, it's patient. I had spent years building safeguards for scenarios executives preferred not to imagine. This was one of them. I had assumed professionalism would protect continuity, when it didn't. The contract quietly took over. I understood then why the clause had been dismissed as boilerplate. It demanded restraint, not reaction. It favored systems over personalities, contracts over charisma. Anyone chasing quick authority would overlook it because it offered no immediate leverage. It only mattered after a decision had already been made, when reversal was expensive, explanations were awkward, and silence carried more weight than any argument ever could, especially in rooms filled with confident voices and inherited power. The irony was that no one needed to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. The company wasn't suddenly illegal. It was simply no longer permitted to do something it had grown accustomed to doing without thinking. Every expansion, every new agreement, every forward-looking promise now required a right they no longer possessed. That shift didn't create chaos immediately. It created hesitation. Legal teams paused, partners asked careful questions, decisions slowed. The system behaved exactly as designed, just under a different set of permissions. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. This wasn't revenge, it was alignment. The rules hadn't changed, the participants had. And when alignment disappears, access disappears with it. Nothing broke. It just stopped being allowed. And this is where things get weird. When the phone rang, I already knew who it would be. Legal departments don't call former executives casually. Their voices arrive measured, cautious, as if every syllable might be reviewed later. I listened without interruption, letting them speak first carefully. The company's counsel introduced herself formally, then asked whether I had any insight into a licensing irregularity they couldn't explain. I replied evenly, without elaboration or emotion. Check the agreement. Silence followed, thick and revealing. She thanked me, then paused. Inside their offices, the effects surfaced quietly. New contracts stalled at signature. Deal teams delayed announcements they had already scheduled. Partners began requesting clarifications that executives couldn't provide. Nothing failed outright. Progress simply slowed, questions multiplying behind closed conference doors. I stayed outside that process, observing patterns instead of people. Systems behave predictably when permissions change. What once flowed automatically now required review, approval, confirmation. Every hesitation carried cost. I noted timelines lengthening. optimism thinning, confidence leaking from conversations gradually. Another call came later, this time from a commercial partner I recognized immediately. Their tone was careful, almost apologetic. They needed assurances before proceeding further. I didn't argue or persuade. I acknowledged their caution and said nothing more than necessary. By then, rumors had started circulating internally. Finance teams noticed projected revenue shifting downward. Leadership meetings grew longer, less decisive. The absence of authorization made risk visible. No one could ignore it anymore, even those who preferred optimism over facts. I remained calm because escalation would have clarified too much, too soon. The agreement was working exactly as designed. My silence preserved its neutrality. Observation required distance, not involvement. Every unanswered question inside their walls reinforced that distance further still. Late that afternoon, confirmation arrived indirectly. A major enterprise client froze an active transaction pending legal review. No announcement followed. The freeze spoke for itself. It wasn't panic. It was caution precise, rational, unavoidable. I noted the timing and waited. That moment mattered because it marked transition. The issue was no longer internal. External stakeholders had begun protecting themselves. Markets respond faster than boards. Once uncertainty spreads, momentum breaks. I didn't celebrate. I simply acknowledged reality taking shape as expected. The first call hadn't demanded action. It had confirmed alignment. The system was now observing them back. Permission was questioned, then withheld. I remained where I was, attentive and patient. Control doesn't rush. It watches quietly until consequences announce themselves. I thought about how quickly confidence dissolves once trust becomes conditional. Authority alone can't sign contracts. It can't reassure compliance officers. Without authorization, influence shrinks. I watched leverage migrate away from titles toward documents they had dismissed as routine paperwork. Nothing dramatic happened that evening. No systems crashed, no alarms sounded. The damage was procedural, incremental, and real. A single customer pause signaled many more to come. I closed my notebook, knowing observation had given way to inevitability at last. Markets don't wait for internal explanations, and they certainly don't care about bruised egos once uncertainty appears. It spreads with professional courtesy and quiet speed. Banks call first, not to accuse, but to clarify exposure. Auditors follow, asking neutral questions that sound harmless until they repeat them. Enterprise customers are last and most dangerous because they don't explain their pauses. I watched it unfold with detached interest. Credit reviews slowed, payment terms tightened, forecasts were revised using cautious language that meant fear. No one said my name. Yet every conversation orbited the absence they had created. The system hadn't failed. Confidence had. Inside the company, restraint collapsed. The CEO's son reacted the way inexperienced leaders often do when systems resist authority. He raised his voice. He demanded timelines. He ordered teams to fix what he still believed was a technical issue. Fix it now became his favorite sentence, repeated louder each time it failed to produce results. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Nothing was broken. Engineers confirmed performance metrics were stable. Sales teams insisted demand still existed. The problem lived elsewhere. In documents, executives preferred to skim. You can't shout at a contract and expect it to listen. Pressure intensified as more stakeholders circled. Compliance officers flagged risk. External counsel requested documentation that hadn't been reviewed in years. Each request arrived politely, yet carried weight. Delays accumulated. Meetings stretched late. Authority lost its rhythm. Enterprise clients began adjusting behavior. One postponed deployment. Another requested indemnification that no one could authorize. Their lawyers didn't threaten. They waited. Waiting is leverage when revenue depends on certainty. By the end of the week, the situation reached the legal department's doorstep. They had been monitoring quietly, hoping escalation wouldn't be necessary. When summoned, they didn't argue or defend leadership decisions. They reviewed facts, traced signatures, and reread provisions executives had dismissed as standard language. That was when resistance met reality. The CEO's son demanded reassurance, expecting compliance to restore momentum through effort alone. The response was measured, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. We don't control the license. The room reportedly went silent. Authority had collided with permission and lost. Titles couldn't override conditions. Urgency couldn't manufacture rights. The market had reacted correctly. And now the company understood why. I noted the timing. Aware that this moment marked the shift from confusion to consequence, I didn't intervene or celebrate. Observation remained my role, and distance preserved clarity. Each external inquiry tightened pressure without my involvement. The company faced its own reflection through market response. That tension, growing and undeniable, replaced denial with urgency. I remained still, knowing momentum had shifted beyond personalities and into systems that never negotiate. They only enforce what was already agreed upon now. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. Power behaves strangely when it discovers its limits, after days of unanswered questions and stalled deals. The CEO's son decided the problem required decisiveness, from what I later learned. He called an emergency meeting and announced that the license would be renewed immediately. No negotiations, no revisions, just signatures. He believed authority could substitute for authorization. The paperwork moved fast, too fast. Drafts circulated marked urgent. Executives were told to clear schedules. The assumption was simple: if the company signed something confidently enough, reality would follow. That approach works with people. It does not work with contracts written to resist pressure. External counsel was brought in late, which was the first mistake. They weren't invested in internal politics or succession plans. Their job was to read, interpret, and advise when they reviewed the proposed renewal. They stopped the process within minutes, not dramatically, not emotionally. They asked one question that ended everything: who currently satisfied the key person condition. No one answered. The response that followed wasn't defiant or argumentative, it was procedural. Without the designated technical authority in place, no renewal was possible. There was nothing to extend. The prior permission had already lapsed. Any attempt to override that condition would expose the company to immediate liability. The lawyers declined to proceed. I wasn't invited to that meeting. I wasn't asked to attend remotely. No one reached out to negotiate or explain. My absence spoke louder than any refusal could have. They were discovering what power looks like when it operates without permission. Busy, frustrated, and ineffective. Inside the company, reactions varied. Some executives argued for creative interpretations. Others suggested temporary workarounds. Each idea collapsed under scrutiny. Contracts don't care about intention, they care about structure. The structure had been set years earlier, when patience mattered more than speed. What followed wasn't chaos, it was accounting. Revenue projections were revised downward quietly, then again more aggressively. Analysts adjusted models. Finance departments replaced optimism with caution. The result was unavoidable and precise. Official figures confirmed a 71% drop in projected revenue tied directly to licensed products. No one announced it publicly at first. Numbers traveled internally, stripped of commentary. The magnitude was impossible to misinterpret. Authority had failed to protect income. Confidence had failed to secure continuity. The system responded exactly as designed, without malice or mercy. I observed all of this from a distance, deliberately absent. Invisibility was part of the design now. Showing up would have turned a structural failure into a personal negotiation. I had no interest in that. The lesson needed to remain impersonal. Power assumes compliance. Permission requires alignment. When the two diverge, only one survives. Watching that distinction become measurable was almost instructive. Almost. By the time the revenue impact was acknowledged internally, the outcome was irreversible. They had tried to sign their way out of a condition they no longer satisfied. The numbers didn't argue back. They simply settled where reality placed them. The call for an emergency board meeting came later than it should have. By the time directors assembled, the damage was no longer theoretical. Numbers had shifted, partners had paused, and confidence had thinned. What remained was confusion mixed with urgency, the kind that forces people to finally read what they once trusted others to summarize. I wasn't present, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly what they were looking for. Printed copies of the licensing agreement were distributed, thicker than anyone remembered. Pages turned slowly, questions surfaced, then stalled. As directors began noticing how many decisions had been delegated without understanding their foundations, they read the agreement from the beginning this time, not skimming for conclusions. Definitions mattered. Conditions mattered. The room grew quieter as comprehension replaced assumption. The language was clear and unambiguous, written without drama, without loopholes. Permission existed only under a specific circumstance, and that circumstance no longer applied. Someone finally said my name, not with anger or blame, but recognition. The connection formed reluctantly, then completely. Terminating me hadn't just removed an employee. It had removed a requirement. The license didn't fail because of misconduct or breach. It expired because the conditions supporting it had been deliberately eliminated. The realization changed the tone immediately. This wasn't a technical outage or a legal dispute. It was a governance failure. The board saw it then. How a decision framed as efficiency had undermined continuity. Authority had acted without understanding the system it commanded. There were attempts to soften the conclusion. Could the clause be interpreted differently? Could intent override structure? External counsel had already answered those questions. Contracts don't respond to intent. They respond to conditions being met or unmet. The simplicity of it made the mistake harder to escape. I imagined the moment clearly. Directors leaning back, rereading the same sentences, searching for flexibility that wasn't there, silence filling the gaps between pages. The uncomfortable truth settling in, they had approved my removal without realizing they had also approved the loss of permission. This was the point where justice began to form. Quietly and without celebration, no one needed to accuse anyone. The facts accused themselves. Responsibility became collective, which made it heavier. The board wasn't dealing with a rebellious inventor or an overreaching executive. They were dealing with their own oversight. The question lingered because everyone understood what undoing would require. It wasn't rehiring pride or restoring titles. It meant admitting the system had been misunderstood, that governance had failed its own safeguards, and that correction would demand humility no one had planned for at the highest possible level. Then, someone asked the question that had been avoided since the beginning, the one that carried both hope and dread. Can we undo this? I didn't take the board's call immediately. Silence, when used correctly, clarifies intent. When I finally agreed to speak, there were no demands on my side, no anger to manage. I listened as they explained urgency, damage, and regret, each word carefully chosen to sound responsible rather than desperate. They asked if I would return, not as an employee, not as a favor, but as a solution. Titles were offered vaguely. Compensation was mentioned indirectly. I declined before any number could be stated. Money had never been the point. Control had. I told them I wasn't interested in reversing decisions through sentiment. I didn't want apologies, bonuses, or ceremonial authority. I wanted order restored to something that had been treated casually. Contracts exist to remove emotion from outcomes, and emotion was suddenly everywhere. That imbalance needed correction, not negotiation. They pressed gently, then harder. Could we structure something temporary? Could I step in quietly while they reorganized leadership? I declined again, calmly, consistently. Re-entering their system would blur responsibility. The clause had worked precisely because it was impersonal. I wasn't about to weaken it by turning consequences into conversations. What I did say surprised them. I explained that the license wasn't a weapon. It was a framework designed to ensure continuity under competent stewardship. If they wanted access again, they needed alignment, not urgency. That meant respecting conditions they had ignored, not rewriting them after damage was done. The conversation slowed. Silence returned, heavier this time. They realized I wasn't negotiating leverage. I was protecting structure. Quiet power doesn't argue. It sets boundaries and waits. Before the call ended, I made one clarification. I wasn't withholding anything out of spite. I was simply no longer the appropriate party to provide what they needed. That responsibility had already shifted. What they didn't know yet was that I had spoken to someone else, not to threaten them, not to create spectacle. A competitor had reached out days earlier, asking careful questions about licensing frameworks and governance discipline. We spoke professionally, without haste. They understood conditions. They respected them. When I ended the call with the board, nothing had been resolved for them. For me, everything had been. Power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly. Once you decide not to step back into places that mistook your presence for permission, I chose restraint because escalation would have confused justice with ego. Walking away preserved clarity. It allowed consequences to unfold without distortion. In that space, I remained unseen, yet effective. Influence shifted where it belonged, away from volume and toward validity. I didn't need to return to demonstrate control. Control was already operating, silently. through agreements that required no reminders, no signatures, and no permission beyond what had been defined. That was enough, because systems remember discipline longer than people remember authority. When consequences arrive, without warning or mercy at all. I didn't rush the new license. Precision mattered more than speed now. When I agreed to proceed, it was with terms that reflected reality, not optimism. The framework was tighter, cleaner, and enforced by structures instead of promises. Conditions were explicit. Compliance was mandatory. Oversight was external. The new agreement required independent audits, scheduled and unscheduled, conducted by firms that answered to no one involved in sales or leadership. Reporting obligations were non-negotiable. Expansion rights were limited by design, not convenience. Every clause assumed misuse was possible and planned accordingly. This wasn't punishment, it was discipline, written clearly enough to survive ambition. The competitor accepted without hesitation. They asked thoughtful questions, not defensive ones. They understood that licensing wasn't ownership, and access wasn't entitlement. What they gained was stability. What they surrendered was improvisation. The system would work, but only within boundaries. That alignment made execution fast. Once the deal became visible, the shift was immediate. Customers followed permission, not loyalty. Markets rarely do. Contracts migrated. Pipelines rerouted. The company I had built the technology for lost ground quickly, not because they were targeted, but because they no longer qualified. Market share doesn't wait for internal reflection. Inside my former company, leadership fractured, departments blamed each other. Revenue losses demanded explanations that couldn't be softened. The board faced numbers that removed ambiguity. This was no longer about innovation or vision, it was about accountability. The CEO's son tried to contain the fallout. He framed it as transition pain, temporary disruption, external pressure. None of it landed. Authority without results convinces no one. Confidence without permission evaporates. Directors began asking different questions, the kind that end careers quietly. A vote was scheduled. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Governance, when it finally activates, prefers procedure over spectacle. The conclusion arrived through consensus, not confrontation. The person who had initiated the decision that severed permission was removed from operational authority. I learned about it afterward, not through celebration, but confirmation. The system had corrected itself. My involvement was complete. Licensing, done right, doesn't seek revenge, it restores order. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply allowed access to move toward competence. The irony wasn't lost on me. The technology hadn't changed, the rules hadn't changed, only the understanding of them had. Power had shifted away from volume and toward structure, where it belonged. Controlled outcomes don't explode outward, they collapse inward, neatly, leaving behind a market that continues functioning without drama. That was the final outcome, not triumph, resolution. It ended without applause, lawsuits, or speeches. Just balance restored. The company moved on smaller, the market moved on smarter, and I moved on knowing the framework had done exactly what it was built to do. Long after anyone remembered who wrote it, that quiet correction mattered more than any victory I could have claimed in public view. Justice rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, after the arguments fade and the systems finish correcting what people broke. By the time everything settled, there were no court filings, no statements, no victory laps. I never sued them. I never threatened them. I didn't need to. The structure did its work without my participation. I watched from a distance as the company adjusted to a smaller version of itself. Operations narrowed, ambitions recalibrated. What remained was functional, compliant, and slower. That wasn't punishment, it was alignment. Law doesn't humiliate. It restores boundaries that should never have been crossed. Some people expected anger from me. Others expected satisfaction to look louder than it did. The truth was simpler. I felt steady, calm. Justice, when it's real, doesn't spike your pulse, it lowers it. There was no revenge in letting a contract operate as written. There was only acceptance that decisions carry consequences whether anyone likes them or not. I never returned their calls after that final confirmation. There was nothing left to discuss. Apologies don't reinstate permission. Regret doesn't rewrite conditions. The company had made a choice based on confidence instead of comprehension. The outcome followed naturally. What mattered most was what didn't happen. No one was dragged into court. No headlines questioned motives. No careers ended with public spectacle. The correction was internal, procedural, and complete. Markets adjusted, customers moved on. The system continued under new stewardship. As systems are meant to do, I didn't gain power from this. I released it. Control shifted away from personalities and back into frameworks where it belonged. That's the difference between authority and legitimacy. One demands obedience, the other survives scrutiny. Looking back, I'm grateful the clause existed, not because it protected me, but because it protected continuity from arrogance. It didn't reward me. It restrained everyone equally. That kind of fairness doesn't feel dramatic, but it lasts longer than outrage ever could. This wasn't a story about winning. It was a story about restraint, about choosing not to escalate when escalation would have blurred responsibility, about trusting that rules, when written carefully, don't need guardians. They enforce themselves. Friends asked if I felt vindicated. If the silence tasted sweet, I told them it tasted neutral. Justice doesn't comfort or congratulate. It simply leaves you standing where the line actually is. Aware of your footing, that awareness changes how you move next, slower, cleaner, unwilling to trade clarity for applause ever again. When decisions test patience and reward discipline over impulse alone quietly, I walked away without bitterness, without trophies, without noise. What remained was clarity, and that was enough. I didn't destroy their company. They removed the only condition keeping it legal. As I look back on everything that happened, the message feels simple and personal. Real strength doesn't come from reacting fast, but from standing firmly in what you've built when you act with patience and clarity. The outcome often speaks for itself. I'm curious, did you see a part of yourself in this story? And which moment touched you the most? Let me know where you're listening from. And if this story connected with you, you're warmly invited to leave a comment, tap like, share it with someone who might understand, and subscribe to keep walking this path together.